Today, we're going to start talking about one of the most difficult economic times in our nation's history, the Great Depression. This was a time that saw steep declines in industrial production and prices, mass unemployment, banking panics, sharp increases in poverty and homelessness. Industrial production fell nearly 47%. Gross domestic product declined by 30%, and the unemployment rate peaked at 25%. Now, it's important to mention that we're not going to come to some definite conclusion as to what caused the Great Depression. After almost 100 years, economic experts still disagree as to the main causes. So we're not going to find some magical answer to that question in the little bit of time that we have to spend on the topic in here. However, there are a few contributing factors that almost everyone can agree on, so we're going to focus on those. First of all is a topic that we briefly referenced in our last unit, and that was the struggles that farmers were experiencing in the Roaring '20s. Like we mentioned before, crop prices rose significantly during World War I. American farmers were producing massive amounts of crops to provide food for the Allied armies. Many farmers bought new equipment and land to meet the increase in demand. However, this increase was only temporary. Once the war ended and countries like France were no longer a war zone, European farmers could once again focus on feeding their own people, and the need for American crops went down. So knowing what we know from economics class about the laws of supply and demand, it should come as no surprise that the price of farm goods dropped by about 40% following World War I. Under normal conditions, that would be bad, but these weren't normal conditions. Like I said, many farmers had bought new equipment and land to increase their production. Most times, these types of purchases require loans. So when the prices dropped, many farmers found themselves in a situation where they were unable to repay money they had borrowed from the banks. When that happens, banks begin to fail. The whole reason they give those loans is to make money, right? They're not just doing it to be nice. They loan the money, and then when it's paid back over time with interest, the banks make a profit. But if that money can't be paid back, now they're losing money. Because of this, many rural banks ended up going out of business. And when that happened, whoever had their money in savings accounts within that bank lost everything. So even people who did not have debt, but had put their money in a bank that had to shut down, lost everything. And see, this has a bit of a snowball effect, because once a few banks started to close, other people would start scrambling to withdraw their money from their banks so that if their bank closed, they wouldn't lose everything too. Well, this is called a run on the banks. And a bunch of people withdrawing their money had the same effect as those loans that couldn't be paid back, and more banks were forced to close. Now, it is important to understand that there are safety nets in place today to prevent this from happening and to ensure that people don't lose their money. They're actually a direct result of what happened during the Great Depression, and we'll talk about those in a later video. But at this time, those safety nets didn't exist, and so pretty soon, bank after bank was failing. In the first 10 months of 1930, 744 banks failed, and throughout the decade of the 30s, about 9,000 banks across the nation failed. This had severe impacts. In just the years from 1929 to 1932, 400,000 farms went into foreclosure. Basically, foreclosure is when you're no longer able to pay the money you owe on your property, so you lose it. And the thing with foreclosures is that they don't only affect those that are losing their house. Obviously, they're the most dramatically impacted. But if a person is unable to make their payments and the bank that loaned them the money takes control of the property, the thing is, the banks aren't interested in owning real estate. That's not what they do. So they'll often do whatever they can to sell it and get the money they're still owed. That generally results in the property being sold for less than it would normally be worth. When that happens on a large scale, it can bring down the value of everyone in the area. For example, if I'm trying to sell my house, but there are 3 houses around me that are foreclosed and selling at reduced rates for a variety of reasons, it would make it much more difficult to sell my house at what had been the normal rate. Then the next two factors that we're going to talk about go hand in hand. They are unequal distribution of wealth and the availability of easy credit. While the Roaring Twenties gave the appearance of great prosperity, the reality is that the booming economy was only impacting a small percentage of the population. The income of the wealthiest 1% of Americans grew by 75% during this time. However, the income of Americans as a whole increased by only 9%. See, over 70% of the American families earned less than $2,500 a year, which was then considered to be the minimum income needed to afford a decent standard of living. And again, over 70% of Americans weren't there. Most Americans were not experiencing any of the benefits of the economic gains of the 20s. And that brings us to the other factor, which is the availability of easy credit. This is another thing we talked about in the last unit. Since most American families didn't have enough income to buy much more than the basic necessities, buying on credit was what allowed people to purchase all the latest and greatest technologies that were coming out in the 20s. But it was also causing the average American to pile up debt by living beyond their means. When that happens, eventually, either people are forced to stop spending money, which slows the economy, or they continue to rack up debt until they're unable to pay it off, which also is bad for the economy. The final factor that we're going to mention is tariffs. In 1930, the government passed what is known as the Hawley-Smoot Tariff. It was a protective tariff that was supposed to protect American farmers and manufacturers from foreign competition by increasing the taxes being placed on foreign goods that are imported into the country. Now, over 1,000 economists had signed a petition urging President Hoover. We should probably establish the fact that President Hoover, Herbert Hoover, won the 1928 election in a landslide over Democratic opponent Al Smith and was in office while all of this was going on. So like I said, back to the Hawley-Smoot Tariff. Over 1,000 economists signed a petition urging Hoover to veto this bill, but he didn't. And the fears of those economists came true when other nations retaliated with high tariffs of their own. So at a time when what the world needed was more trade, global trade dropped by over 40%, dragging down companies that relied on importing and exporting and bringing much of the developed world into this depression with us. Now, the stock market crash of 1929 is often thought of as the beginning of the Great Depression, but in reality, these economic problems were already present, and while the crash may have accelerated things, it didn't necessarily cause them. See, through the 1920s, American stock prices continued to rise, and many Americans bought stocks with the dreams of getting rich quick. Now, we're not going to get into the inner workings of the stock market. That's more of a subject for economics. But people continued to make risky investments and even bought on margin, which means they borrowed money to invest in the stock market. Now, as long as the value of your stock goes up, that's great. You can pay off your loan and still have profits left over. But if you do that, if you buy on margin and the value of your stocks go down, now you've got problems. Cracks started to show in early September of 1929 when stock prices fell slightly, causing some to sell their stocks. See, the problem is that as people want to sell their stocks, that makes the prices fall. And on October 24th, there was a more severe drop, causing more people to want to sell their stocks before they became even more worthless. And then on October 29th, 1929, a day that has come to be known as Black Tuesday, the bottom fell out. Values plummeted as investors frantically tried to sell their stocks before they became worthless. But again, it was this frantic selling that caused the stock prices to become even more worthless. And by mid-November, American investors in the stock market had lost about $30 billion, an amount equal to the total amount of money that the U.S. had spent on fighting World War I. And with that, American life would dramatically change. The era of the Roaring Twenties was now giving way to the greatest economic crisis in American history. So that is a basic introduction to the beginnings of the Great Depression. In the coming days, we'll continue to look at the Depression and the impact that it had on everyday American life.